Indians, basically I still refer to myself as an Indian because it's how I'm angered from how the government has treated us thusly so far, and in the future to be just pushed around and taken from those kind of things. And sarcastically call myself an Indian. Indien, in, all kinds of terms like that I've come across through my life growing up. And the most recent two names I came across while in Gold River playing in a slope pitch tournament. The native teams there, that's what their names on their jerseys said. One was capital N, capital D, and capital N. The other one was INDIN.
But when I used to do applications for jobs, it always asked what nationality you were. And I said I was a non-existing person because I was no longer native. How could I say I'm native when they told me I wasn't? So what am I? Am I Japanese? Am I Chinese? I'm non-existent. And so it was a real hard life for me. Till 1985, I was the guinea pig for the Indian Affairs where I worked. I worked there only so I could help my people, because many people went to Indian Affairs. They got a runaround. They never got answers, and they would go there for days and still get a runaround. And lots of them would wait for me to get back. If I was on a holiday, they would wait because they didn't know how to read or write, and they wanted me to fill in their applications for their status. Unfortunately, a lot of the tribes did not take back the women that had lost their status. I know many older women from even Haida Gwaii that are buried in Vancouver in Burnaby because they never got their status back in time to go home. So they're way far away from their families, and one of the ladies had 13 children and never got to go be with her family. And people think that Indian Affairs is great. They gave back our status, but they should have never taken it. come under Bill C-31, which is because I married my husband. In 1970, it was against the law to marry anyone who didn't have a status card or you were disenfranchised. And so they enfranchised me, and 1985, under Bill C-31, I got back my status. And yet I came from a hereditary family, and my poor mom never got to see me be Native again, which sounds crazy. My husband's father lost his status in the First World War that Canada entered, and took all these Native men and stripped them of their Native status, whether they were Army, Navy, clergy, Air Force, adopted. They lost their status. So we got many men came home. Where are they going to go? Can't go back to the reserve because they took their status away. So they ended up on Skid Row, lots of them. Lots of them got into alcohol because they were so sad they couldn't go home. So I worked with that group probably about 8 years, telling stories about how they could go home and why they were where they were. Like a lot of the ones that were in Courtney, their dads were in the Air Force or whatever, and they just stayed there after they got out of the Air Force. They just stayed there. And so they didn't understand where they belonged, and most of them had died and hadn't told the story. So when I went and told the story, then they knew. And they had to keep asking me, well, was that the truth? And I go, yes. When I first came here in 1999, back home to Campbell River, where I was born and raised, I was asked by a Native women's group in Courtney to go and talk to the ladies. They had probably about 30 women in their little organization. Can you come and do some history and tell us a little about your culture? And I went. And I started talking, and I looked around and I was shocked. People were crying. And I stopped and I said, have I offended you people? And they said, no, we now know what happened. No one ever told us the story. And I was talking about how all the men weren't allowed to go home. And they didn't even know about Bill C-31, so a lot of them hadn't even gone home. Now they have. Now they've gone home to maybe Saskatchewan or Ontario, they now moved back home understanding what Bill C-31 was. Because no one really, it wasn't really publicized enough for people to know that it was, that they could go back home. And it's amazing because some of them were siblings and they didn't even know.
Colonists, my mother's family, my father's family. The colonists disrupted our family lineage so badly. It's suffering really drastically right now. Having Mr. Sue come into our family from my father's side is kind of really damning, but that's the way the world works. And I started growing to not like all the things I've started learning about that man, and I still don't to this day. If it wasn't for our grandmother, I wouldn't have any respect at all for that part of my family. And it's hard to have respect for them, how things are going politically with the families, period, because they're doing everything in their power to stay foremost and at the forefront of the whole band, village. I'll use village, that's an easy one to use when we're labeling our people's property. Our villages are overwhelmed with people in our offices like that are exactly like the government. They're there to take care of themselves rather than truly take care of the people properly.